I'm Max Boykoff. I'm a professor here at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm also a fellow in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, or CERES, here. I hope that those of you here were able to catch our first panel on rural broadband. If so, thank you for joining us. If you weren't able to do that, we will be posting up the recording along with this one and the session that'll follow at 2:15 Mountain Time on carbon markets up on our website if you'd like to check out, rewatch them later. There's many people to thank for the panels that we have today. Many collaborators and co-sponsors, among them Kristen Eulenbrock and her team at the Institute for Science and Policy in Denver. Thanks also to CERES. Thank you to the Western Water Assessment, where Benét is leading things. Thank you to the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State. Thank you to the Center for Creative Climate Change, Creative Climate Communication and Behavior Change, C3BC. Thank you to CoLabs as well, run by Dan Powers, who was leading the previous session. And then thank you as well to AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. That is the group that we've partnered with through this Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. In this set of panels, the one here and the others before and after, this overall legislative event coming at the end of the legislative session here in Colorado has been designed to foster discussions, to take stock, to help us move forward with interactions between scientists, decision makers, and Colorado constituents. There's definitely a wealth of knowledge in our state. There's a lot going on, and this network purposefully works to help improve the connectivity and coordination among all that great work to help catalyze positive change at the science, policy, technology, and society intersections here in our state. So I'm going to turn it over to Presley to briefly introduce Benét, and then off we go.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Please welcome Benét Duncan, the facilitator of our second open panel, highlighting our Colorado-LSEN climate and environment focus area with this discussion on climate-informed decision-making. Benét Duncan is the Managing Director of Western Water Assessment, the CERES signature integrating activity, relying on multidisciplinary teams of experts on climate, hydrology, ecology, law, and policy to work with decision makers across the Rocky Mountain West to produce policy relevant information about climate variability and change. She is also on the advisory board of the AAAS Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. Thanks for joining us today, Benét.
Thanks for having me, Presley. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm excited to hear what all of our panelists have to say. We have a really exciting group of panelists, and I'm wondering, this will maybe be a real-time question for Presley and David. I know that we had prepared a little poll to get to know the attendees as well, to get to know everyone who's joining us today. I don't know if that's ready to display. If not, I'll introduce our panelists, and then maybe we can show that poll and just learn a bit more about the folks who are attending today.
Let's start with that, with the introductions.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so like I mentioned, we have a really great set of panelists for everybody today. We've got Russ Schumacher is the Colorado State Climatologist, and he's the director of the Colorado Climate Center. In addition to his duties there, he's also an associate professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Kelly Mahoney is a research meteorologist in NOAA's Earth System Research Laboratory's Physical Sciences Lab, and on their hydrometeorology modeling and applications team. And she enjoys working with stakeholders at the local, state, and federal levels to better inform water management, forecasting, and emergency preparedness. Laurna Kaatz is the climate scientist for Denver Water, which serves high quality water and promotes its efficient use to 1.5 million people in the city of Denver and many surrounding suburbs. And then Sarah Jones is the Director of Sustainability and Community Engagement at Steamboat Ski and Resort Corporation. And before joining Steamboat, she was the Executive Director of the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council. And I'm intentionally keeping my introductions of them brief so that they can introduce themselves a bit more as well as we run through the panel. But before we go into questions for the panel, we thought it would be really great to learn more about the folks who are attending today. And so we had, let me find my questions that we wanted to ask you all. If you can, in the chat, as we're talking today, we would love to hear about what climate impacts or concerns keep you up at night in your own roles and organizations, and then what gives you hope. So yeah, what's giving you heartburn, what's keeping you up at night, and then what gives you hope. And let's see. And David, I didn't know if that, I know we talked about doing a poll just to learn about what parts of Colorado you're all from, but if that's not ready, no big deal.
Yeah, I put the questions that you just asked, Benét, into the chat. And if you also want to include in the chat where you're located, the poll function wasn't working for me.
Oh, got it. Great.
And I would say that as people are answering this question, we can kind of move to Russ's presentation. I would suggest that.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Yeah, so with that, I'll hand it over to Russ Schumacher to give us a little presentation about kind of what we're seeing in Colorado now.
All right. Let me get that going. Look okay? Does it look okay? You can hear me okay?
It looks great. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, I think I'll be the only one to be throwing PowerPoints at you here, but we just kind of wanted to give a bit of an introduction to what we know about Colorado's climate, what we are looking at, and what we may have to worry about to lead into some of the other discussion. And before getting into that, I just give a quick introduction to what we do at the Colorado Climate Center. So we've been based at Colorado State University Atmospheric Science Department since the 1970s. We're the climate office for the state, and we focus on 3 areas: climate monitoring, so pulling in data, collecting our own data, and so forth; climate research, especially applied climate research as it pertains to issues that affect Colorado and surrounding areas, and then climate services. And mainly this is to just let everyone know, if you're not familiar with our office, that we're a resource if it comes to data or information about what's going on in our weather and climate around the state, education, and so forth. And so some of the things that we do in the office that will then kind of lead into some of the broader discussion here going forward is, keeping an eye on what's happening, how much it's rained or not rained in certain areas. So kind of consistent monitoring of what's happening around the state. We provide input and kind of aggregate information that goes to the U.S. Drought Monitor for Colorado. And so we provide recommendations each week based on our local analysis of what's going on that then goes into the Drought Monitor, which a lot of people are certainly familiar with and is used widely around, not just in Colorado, but around the country. Our office is the headquarters for COCORAS, the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And this is a network of volunteer observers. You can put a rain gauge in your backyard or wherever it's convenient and measure rain and snow and hail. And this has grown from a network that started right here at CSU in Fort Collins after the Fort Collins flood in 1997, and is now nationwide, all 50 states, and Canada, and the Bahamas. And so it's a huge resource of information about precipitation and water. We get to do some fun and interesting things like confirm new state records, and we set the new state record hailstone a couple of years ago, as well as the new state record high temperature in 2019. We operate another network called COAGMET, which is weather stations in agricultural parts of Colorado, and that's data that's available to anyone who's interested in it. And we're trying to expand the use of it. And then we work with our stakeholders, especially at the state government level. As one example, the state's water availability task force, in conjunction with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So that's just a quick introduction of what we do at the Colorado Climate Center. But let's dive into Colorado's climate a little bit, and what we know, and what we are still trying to understand. And so there's no discussion about Colorado's climate. The starting place always has to be the mountains. This is a topographic map of Colorado showing the lower terrain in the whites and red colors, and then the mountains in the blues. And so very, very complex, as we're all familiar with. And then if we go from there to a map of average precipitation across Colorado, you'll see that they look quite similar. And that's no accident. And we have such a diverse range of climates across our state, which makes it a really interesting and fascinating place to study, but also quite challenging. And so this goes, this shows annual average precipitation everywhere from the desert of the San Luis Valley, with less than 7 or 8 inches of rain on average per year, up to the Park Range in northern Colorado, east of Steamboat, that averages more than 50 inches of precipitation each year, most of that coming in snow in the winter. And then a little bit of everything in between, from the variation from the valleys to the Palmer Divide on the eastern plains, the valleys and mountains on the western slope, and just so many interesting variations there to try and keep track of, and makes challenge to measure what's happening in all these areas. And similarly, it's highly variable seasonally. So this map shows the different colors here represent the month that on average is the wettest month at each location. And Colorado is the only state that can claim all 12 months to show up on this map. And so if you go in the Eastern Plains, it's the spring through the summer that are the wettest months. Parts of Western Colorado, it's the fall that's the wettest. And then you go into the mountains and it's a bit of everything. Some places it's the winter, some places it's the spring. And so again, very fascinating climate that we have, but with challenging monitoring efforts, and also challenging to pin down what the impacts of climate change will be in all of these different areas. And so that kind of sets us up, taking an average across the state is always a little bit misleading when it comes to Colorado, because there are so many different areas and such sharp changes from high elevations to low elevations. But if we take that average and do with it what we can, and we look at temperature, right? This is kind of the story of climate change globally, and it plays out here in Colorado as well, where we've seen warming temperatures over the last 125 years or so, where we have good records, and even the faster warming in the more recent 30 years there. And certainly, it's all becoming apparent, as we go forward with time. Of our 8 warmest years statewide on record, 6 of those have happened since 2012. And so that's just kind of setting the stage for some of the more on the ground changes that we're seeing. Then if we look at precipitation, this is one way of looking at precipitation. This is, again, statewide average, so it does kind of smooth things out across the terrain and so forth. But this is a metric we look at a lot called standardized precipitation index, and it basically just tells you how unusually wet or dry it is. And this is over long time periods, 4 years. And so what we see are, so the greens here are periods where it's wet over long periods of time over the whole state. The browns are where it's dry. We have the history of serious droughts in Colorado. The turn of the 20th century, major drought, especially in Western Colorado, the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, the drought of the 50s, the late 70s, and then these 3 pretty significant droughts since 2000, in around 2002 to 2003, and then 2012, and then the current period that's ongoing. And so this metric considers precipitation only, and so it sort of gives you the picture that, yep, we have wet periods and dry periods. They come and go, going from drought to wet. But as we saw with the temperature change, that actually has pretty substantial impacts on water resources, as we'll hear more about as we go forward here. And so what I'm going to do here is change this picture from the standardized precipitation index that only looks at precipitation to add in the effects of rising temperature, because a warmer atmosphere is thirstier for water, essentially. And so it will pull more water out of the soil or the crops or the forest or whatever the case might be. And so if we change this picture of SPI to SPEI that includes this evapotranspiration component, it tells a pretty different picture over the last 20 years or so, where we're in essentially a long-lasting dry period since 2000, with some periods that are less dry, but those wet periods of around, that appeared at a couple points in the last 20 years just in precipitation are no longer there, and it's just sort of a steady dry period. And so this is kind of the compounding effect of climate change on our naturally dry environment in Colorado, and causing more stress on water resources in many different ways that we'll hear more about. And this is most prominent in summer. So this graph is a little bit technical, but essentially what it shows, if you look at the blue line here, it's showing the variation of temperature from year to year over each of the seasons. And basically it shows that, and this probably resonates with everyone, the variability is high in the winter and the spring. We have some very cold years, very warm years, everything in between, a lot of variation. But in the summer, the variations aren't generally as big. And so the hottest hots and the coldest colds in the summer are not that different from each other. And then the orange line here shows the warming trend over this period. And so essentially what this is showing is that the warming trend since over the last 40 years is on par with that natural variability, meaning that the effect of the warming is going to stand out the most in the summer. The signal will appear strongest. Summer is when the atmosphere wants to take that water out of the ground because it's naturally warmer. And so those impacts show up even more apparently in the summertime. And kind of another way to interpret this is basically that what we would have thought was a warm summer 75 years ago is now what we would consider a cool summer in Colorado. And we have high confidence that this is going to continue if greenhouse gas emissions continue on the path that they're on. Clearly, there are different scenarios that may play out in the future as far as that goes, but the warming is expected to continue, and it's a question of how much that will continue going forward out, by the 50 years from now or so, several degrees, to quite a few degrees more of warming, depending on the emissions scenario going forward. So what does this all mean? These are, this is the data that we look at all the time, but obviously it's the impacts that are of concern here, and they're wide ranging. But I think the big ones that kind of affect everyone in Colorado in one way or another are water. And so we now are in this kind of historic drought in the southwestern United States that's bringing water levels in Lake Powell down, but of course locally in Colorado reservoirs as well. And wildfires, we saw the just record-smashing wildfire season last year. That's still fresh on many people's minds, and that's going to be a concern going forward. Of course, there are many other impacts that we could talk about as well. So I will stop there as sort of the introduction, and here's some information about our office and how to contact me. But we'll now move on to our other panelists to kind of dive into some of the more, the ways that this climate information can play out in decision making.
Thank you so much, Russ. That was really great. Really, I think, valuable context for the conversation that we'll be having over the next 40 minutes. And so with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to our panelists and let them kind of introduce themselves through the framing of a question. And that question is, can you please tell us about some of the climate-related challenges that you face in your work and how you use climate information to navigate those challenges? Or could you share about a time that you've developed climate information that had direct impacts on decisions that people in Colorado are making? And so I think it's probably easier if I just call you out one by one, and we can go through with these self-introductions and the framing of that question. So let's see, I'm just gonna go in order of people on my screen. So Kelly Mahoney, you're up first.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me today. My name again is Kelly Mahoney. I work in Boulder at the NOAA Physical Sciences Lab, and I'm a research scientist there, and my area of research focus is generally on flood risk and extreme rainfall. And as a scientist at NOAA, I get to work with an array of public and private stakeholders at the local, state, and federal levels. So really lucky that way to be able to bring weather and climate information to really a good array of societal problems. So in terms of how I'll answer this question, I can give you an example of kind of a recent success story. So hopefully helping with the hope aspect of the questions that we asked, and less about the what keeps you up at night. So again, I've been able to work with a number of stakeholders, but over the last couple of years, one I think, again, success story of climate-informed decision-making was with the dam safety branch of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. So we already mentioned water, and living in Colorado, we know that water and the way we manage it is critical to our lives and livelihoods. So when you think about dam safety, the general thing is to protect lives and property around dams. Those dams need to be built to withstand the most amount of rain you would expect to have there, right? You don't want the overtopping or flooding in the surrounding communities. So there's this concept in engineering, it's called probable maximum precipitation, but really all you need to know is that engineers really want to know how hard it can rain ever at any point in Colorado, at any place in Colorado over any period of time, because the dams need to be strong enough, right? Well, that concept has been handled using 1950s era engineering, which doesn't think about climate change at all. So several years ago, Bill McCormick, the chief of our dam safety branch in Colorado, came to scientists at NOAA and the Western Water Assessment at CU and asked what we could do to help update that information. And honestly, just updating the standards that were already in place absent climate change was going to be a big problem to tackle. And as scientists, it's a really meaty question, and so we were going to just dive in and throw all the new data and methods at it. And thankfully, this project, as it got off the ground, had really strong leadership, really strong vision, and kept bringing the scientists and the stakeholders back to the table. And we kept talking about how we were going to make this useful. And about halfway through the project, again, going into it, we weren't even trying to address climate change. We were just trying to make these old methods better. And about halfway through the project, the chief of dam safety came to us again and said, well, you know, that's really great. It's good to update, but what about climate change? And we said, well, I mean, obviously from where we sit as scientists, we know climate change is happening. We know it's affecting the upper bound on precipitation, but we also know there's no roadmap for you guys to incorporate it into what you're doing. So it's going to be an uphill battle. And, you know, quite frankly, this is a community where we haven't usually been asked about climate change. So we weren't sure how to dive in, but Bill and this team of really visionary leaders and this diverse team of expert reviewers said, you know, this is important. We need to do this. So we kind of said, all right, well, let's dive in. And so again, folks with my colleague in particular, Jeff Lucas, who is with Western Water Assessment, and a few others at NOAA, kind of dove in and we tried to distill what we knew about climate extremes, precipitation extremes, climate change in Colorado into some set of tractable recommendations. And it was really hard. As Russ showed, Colorado is a really complex state. And the community we were presenting it to had some very specific needs. But we delivered a set of recommendations, and I kind of thought, again, in my experience with science and climate-informed decision-making to that point, that was going to be it, and that was going to be, you know, what we walked away with. And then the project board said, all right, we're going to put those into practice. We're going to try and make this policy. And I was like, oh gosh, that's awesome, because, you know, as a scientist, you always want people to use what you've done for something good, but I was kind of dubious, or at least, you know, apprehensive as to where it was going to go, what kind of traction it was going to get. Because imagine you're a dam owner and you're being told you're going to have to pay a bunch of extra money potentially if climate change says that the flood risk is getting bigger. So there was some really awesome teamwork and communication that went on from there. The team from the state went out into the communities, kind of did a traveling roadshow of sorts, engaging local stakeholders and explaining and answering questions about the proposed climate change information, which basically took numbers that had been updated and inflated them to account for what we expected the upper bound to potentially be changing when you talk about the role of increasing warmth in the atmosphere and what that can do to extreme rainfall. And after things were accepted statewide by these local communities and sets of dam owners, in December of 2019, Colorado's new maximum precipitation numbers were put into official policy. So, you know, I've glossed over a lot, so I can say, like, just like that, because it was a ton of work, but just like that, Colorado did become the first state to incorporate climate change information into its dam safety rules and operations. So I think that's a pretty awesome milestone, and I'm happy to say that we're at least trying now to let that inspire kind of upscale growth toward the development of a national standard. So hoping to keep this going. So again, I don't want to take up any more time with that specific example, but I hope that kind of seeds a success, or tells you about a success story, maybe seeds discussion as we go. Again, I'm really grateful just to be a part of this panel today. I would love to know, kind of, you know, from the scientist perspective, I think we always want to better position ourselves as scientists to be more accessible and useful to those in the policy and decision-making sectors, and really looking at a success story like this, how to make future efforts like that, you know, less of an initial lift, more part of an existing kind of consistent framework. So I'm all ears and really excited to learn from the rest of the panel and hear from you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, that is just such an incredible project, how that all came together. So thank you for sharing. And before I turn it over to our next panelist, I do want to remind everybody that if you have any questions for our panel today, please feel free to enter them into the chat window, because we'll be collecting them and trying to ask as many as we can today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurna to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laurna Kaatz. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much for having me. So I work at Denver Water. So Denver Water is the oldest and largest water utility in the state of Colorado. We provide drinking water to 1.5 million people, which is a quarter of the state's population. And we provide drinking water. So this is high quality, reliable, safe water that's available to our customers 24/7. One thing I do want to note about Denver Water is our water use is relatively efficient. So our customers use less than 2% of the water used in the state. So an incredibly efficient system. So the story I want to tell starts in 2002. So that's, you know, almost 20 years ago now. But it's important to understand how we got to where we are now. So in 2002, we experienced, and you saw this in Russ's slides, in 2002, we experienced one of the single worst years of drought on record that we would have traditionally seen in a multi-year drought. So it was incredibly intense. This impacted our system pretty significantly. And in July or June of that year, we experienced, at the time, really until last year, the largest wildfire the state has ever experienced in recorded history as well. And that wildfire, the Hayman wildfire, so you guys might be familiar with the name of this fire. It took place in our workhorse watershed, the Cheeseman watershed. And it's a workhorse watershed because we are continuously moving water through that watershed to make sure that we have water to provide our customers. So not only are we dealing with the single worst year that we've ever experienced drought-wise, we are also dealing with this wildfire. So, you know, we plan as a water utility, we plan for droughts. That's basically what we do. We are planning for multi-year droughts, and you saw in Russ's slides, you know, there were droughts in the 30s and then the 50s, in the 70s. And, you know, we are prepared to withstand these long multi-year drought situations. In 2002, kind of, you know, took our feet out from under us because it was a single year event that acted in a way that these multi-year events act. And so for us, we plan for droughts and we plan for wildfires, but we weren't thinking that a drought and a wildfire of that magnitude would be happening, let alone happening in the same year. So these simultaneous natural disasters are something that, you know, now we have experienced, and they're significant. They're very intense. So we can expect to experience them again in the future. So if you imagine, you know, you're in a drought where every single drop of water counts. You're dealing with a wildfire where now you have these water quality issues, and it's really hard to meet these, you know, water quality standards. So taste and odor are just one part of the equation. There's ash and debris and sediment coming down during wildfires, and that continuously come down after these wildfires take place. So, you know, we're struggling to meet our needs during a drought. So since then, and this is really where the climate science plays a key role. So some of the questions that we came up with at that point in time was, you know, is this simultaneous drought and wildfire, is that an anomaly? Well, you know, 20 years later, we know it's not, right? 2012 was very dry. 2018 was very dry. We've had last year, we don't even need to necessarily revisit with the wildfire situation. But one thing that we should note is the troublesome fire has all the hallmarks of climate change, right? It occurred at this high elevation watershed, so above 9,000 feet, during a time of year when we should be seeing snow. It occurred in a year where we were dealing with significant droughts, we were dealing with heat waves, and of course in the 2000s, that region had already been bombarded by the pest infestation. So no, it's not an anomaly, but at the time we were asking, is this an anomaly? And then we wanted to understand, has Colorado experienced anything like this before in the past? So our recorded history, some of our records go back to the 1950s, some go back to, you know, the 1910s, some go back to 1895. But before that, you know, has our region experienced anything like this? And we've learned using climate science and different tools that, yeah, we've experienced much worse droughts in our region, we have paleohydrology or tree ring records that go back to the 1600s, which is, you know, if you're thinking about it in your mind, that's crazy that we can use trees to go back to the 1600s. But it's really cool. And on the Colorado River, we have tree records that go back to the 800s. So we know that our regions have experienced similar and stressful events. Then the next question is, what is it going to look like going forward? And this is really where you start to turn to these really complex science and complex tools to understand what we could be up against in the future. And one of the things we learned is that we can't predict the future, right? We learned that very clearly in 2002. We don't exactly know what the future is going to be, but we know as a water utility, we need to be prepared for whatever it is. So for us, that means bringing climate science into practice. It means thinking and changing the way we do our practices so that we're prepared for whatever the future may be. So a few things I want to highlight based on that experience of 2002 up until now. Number one, we take watersheds very seriously. We consider them to be critical parts of our infrastructure and not just something that should work for us and make it work until the water hits the built infrastructure. So we've invested time and money in wildfire preparedness, watershed health, forestry health to make sure that our watersheds are trending towards being healthy and are able to strive. Number two, we do long-range planning. So Denver Water plans out over 50 years into the future. And as part of our planning, we don't assume we can predict what the future will be. We assume we can't predict the future and we need to be prepared for whatever it will be. So we use scenarios. So we consider what a warmer future and what a hotter future may look like. And we think about how we need to be prepared for those. And then number three, we're actively trying to mainstream climate adaptation into all of our practices as an organization. So mainstreaming is just a fancy word for saying we're trying to streamline and embed climate adaptation thinking into our planning, our decisions, our activities, everything we do as an organization. In doing that, we're directly embedding climate information into our activities and our plans, but we're also helping people think forward and think beyond what we've experienced historically to what we could be experiencing in the future. So maybe I'll stop there with my example, but yeah, I'll share more in a minute. Thanks, Benét.
Fantastic, thank you, Laurna. And next up, we've got Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Benét. And I have to say, when I was asked to participate on this panel, I thought, oh God, I have done science, but I am not in my current role a scientist. And I had this meeting this morning with a professor at Colorado Mountain College, and I said, Nathan, what data do I use? What science do I use? Please help me. And he said, Sarah, you're a practitioner of actionable knowledge. And I said, yes, that's what I am. Whatever it is, that sounds great. And so I think that's, you know, when we talk about the use of science, you know, there's, as Benét mentioned, I am both two titles. I am the director of sustainability, so looking at operational sustainability for the resort, and then community engagement. So I'm also looking at how we adapt and mitigate climate at the local level. So yes, I use that actionable knowledge when I need to get things done. And so I was thinking about today, like, okay, what do we look at when we're making decisions on the mountain? I hate to say it, but right now we're looking at air quality and when we are actually going to close the resort, right? We have the muddy slide fire just happening 8 miles down the road from us. And there is potential that we'll have to close our mountain this summer because of air quality. So that's some of the things we're looking at in part of our decision making. We are also always looking at our water levels, our water temperatures, because that's critical as we think about the fall and our snowmaking. Will there be a call on the Yampa? What does the water level look like? What water will we have access to in October and November when we need to make our snow? So that from the operational side, those are some of those things. Of course, also that climate adaptation piece, right? That variability, and that we are seeing that on the ground at the resort. So we're looking at things like additional snowmaking, or when we open, the resort in the winter. Those are some of those on the ground decisions we make thinking about climate. I would not say you could ask any of my operations guys and say, do you think about climate every day? Do you think about climate change? They would say no, but they could tell you what snow looks like, what the variability looks like, what the temperature looks like day to day, all throughout the year. So that's kind of that practitioner piece. From the community side, you know, throughout our community in rural Northwest Colorado, we rely in almost every aspect of our economy on our natural resources, whether it's the resort, the river, our outdoor rec, agriculture, and even coal extraction. So again, not always talking about climate action, climate preparedness, climate adaptation, but it's something that is in the day-to-day life of every member of Drought County and the Northwest Colorado. So you ask any member of ag community, they know drought conditions, they know how to access that information, super critical to them and their day-to-day decisions, when to hay, how many heads of cattle they're going to raise, what their sheep stock looks like, all those decisions. So although I sometimes wish I did more science in my day today and really called on that data, I think understanding and having access to that information in day-to-day decision making, and that's the role that I like to play in our community. One of the things that we host, I host with the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council and CMC and the Center for Western Water and Weather Extremes. We call it the Yampa Basin Rendezvous, and it's an annual event. And basically what we do is we invite scientists and decision makers together, and we bring them together to talk about different impacts of the climate and climate change and how we're going to use that information and that science to make local policy decisions. So you guys are doing what we've been doing on a much smaller scale, and I really appreciate all the work that has been done and how we can kind of combine those bigger picture and local level discussions about information, data, and how we get it done on the ground. So thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And that is just really scary to think about the air quality and the fire that's going right now. That didn't even click in my brain. Oh my goodness. Well, so before I turn things over to asking more questions, I just want to see, Russ, I know you gave a presentation, which was fantastic, but I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to add, and by way of self-introduction or in thinking about developing or providing climate information in kind of a decision-making context.
I don't know. I mean, we probably can just move on to questions. I guess the one, the thing that's always challenging with this, right, is a lot of times the information that, for example, folks like Sarah really want or really need is not information we can sort of confidently provide. We're providing ranges of possibilities, as as Laurna and Kelly both talked about as well. And certainly this is getting better. So much progress is being made on this, but sort of, what is going to happen on the Steamboat Mountain, 30 years from now, or on someone's farm is kind of not where we're able to do that. So we have to deal with uncertainty, even though we know the general direction that things are moving, right? But then there's a lot of other uncertainty around that hopefully, this is the goal of something like this, right? Is that we all kind of talk together and we can figure out how we can deal with that and best work with it within that constraint and still make that information useful and usable in decision making. So anyway, I'll stop there so we can move on to discussion.
That's great. Thank you. I have a question that builds on that, Russ, but before I ask that, it looks like we have a follow-up question for Kelly related to the project that she was speaking about. And that is, did you observe an overall trend when you updated maximum rainfall events to include current climate conditions? So yeah, maybe could you dig in just a little bit more detail about kind of what you found and what those recommendations were as far as part of that project?
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to follow up in more depth later. There's a lot of documentation on this. I would just say, broadly speaking, even starting from where Russ gave the overview and just highlighting the complexity of Colorado's climate, the answer is the annoying but true. It depends. It depends on where you're looking and what duration of storm you're looking at. Are you talking about a small, short-lived thunderstorm or a long, week-long September 2013 event? The general, the thing that makes it easier to say that there are upward trends in the potential for precipitation is that when you break things down into the ingredients, we knew that we know it's well shown that atmospheric moisture is going to increase in the future. So if you're looking at it sort of in terms of that ingredient and how it feeds into extreme rainfall, you can say that with more confidence than you can attributing actual trends within a state as complex as Colorado. So to try and answer this somewhat concisely, yes, there were trends, and for me to say like quantitatively what they were, it would be like it depends what part of the state and what time frame you're kind of looking at. But what our recommendations boil down to, we're really focusing on the sort of ingredient of moisture and the fact that we know that that's going to the upper bound on how hard it can rain should increase in the future. And that was what the recommendations and the eventual increase in numbers came from.
Awesome, thank you. And I've got a question for you all that kind of draws on a little bit of Kelly and Russ, what you were both alluding to. Like, there are limits to what we can say right now with science, and there's uncertainty and all kinds of just things to navigate when you're trying to produce science for people to use or when you're trying to use science. So I wonder, Laurna and Sarah, from your perspectives, are there gaps or tensions or maybe like opportunities in that space of producing science or using science, this like policymaker, decision maker space and science space? Like, are there tensions or gaps or opportunities from the practitioner side of things?
Yes, there's significant tensions. People want to know what's going to happen, how things are going to be changing, what that looks like on the ground. And that's just not something we can answer really specifically, but there are some things that we know. So I'm part of a group called the Water Utility Climate Alliance. We're a group of 12 utilities from across the nation working together to collaboratively advance water utility climate change adaptation. And we've put together recently a set of leading practices on climate adaptation. And one thing, a few of our practices that, we would recommend people thinking through are, climate change science can only take us so far. You really have to understand the capabilities and limitations of the science. But climate change is here and now. It's not the next generation's challenge. So what do we know? And if you really simply start with a question of what does warming mean to my system, to my decisions, to the work that I'm doing, you're able to make significant progress. So, asking that question helps us use science, but it also helps us make decisions in a way where they're grounded in, reliable information without overusing the science in any one way.
And I would add to that. I think that, Russ talked about variability, and I think there's this iterative process of we get the information, and having that knowledge of the variability or what we can expect helps us in our decision making. And then I think it's useful to go back to scientists and say, okay, this is what it looks like on the ground. And so then we can kind of, develop these partnerships of getting the information and making it usable. How can we, kind of modify a little bit, go back and forth to make it really usable? And also understanding that a lot of times the people who are doing the work on the ground, they just want another piece is the easy access. how can I get that information that I need to help make that decision? So those from the on the ground piece.
Yeah, and we call that kind of that type of practice co-production. So we're co-creating, co-producing this information together with scientists and policymakers. So we understand what the needs are, what the state of the science is, setting our research up for success and usability. And then you have that automatic kind of feedback chain built in. So yeah, great example, Sarah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we've got another question from an attendee in the chat window about East Troublesome Fire. Laurna, you said that it had all the hallmarks or signs of being a manifestation of climate change. So could you and maybe could the panel parse that a bit more in thinking about East Troublesome Fire and climate change?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be a wildfire expert, so I'm not sure I can tell you a lot about, the explicit detail of the wildfire itself. But wildfires are starting to take place at these higher elevation locations, right? And that's something that we haven't seen. Climate change in and of itself is a risk enhancer, and it also creates new risks. So, wildfire is a good example of how it's enhancing these current risks that we already have, but it's changing them in ways that we really weren't thinking we necessarily would see. So you couple that with, our traditional management practices of wildfire in the United States, and you're setting yourself up for significant situations, which is really what we are seeing and what we saw last year. So while I won't say that climate change is causing these fires, it's definitely enhancing the situation. Additionally, it's drying out our watersheds. So that's something that Russ showed in his SPEI graph versus the SPI. So when you look at the precipitation versus the precipitation with evaporation on there, you're seeing this increased evaporation, right? Which is, warming overall causes an aridification of our region. So warming is causing an overall drying of our region. And drying is going to compromise our vegetation. It stresses out our vegetation even more than it already is, because we are in a semi-arid region where it's dry. And drought really is one of our biggest natural disasters that we navigate. So being in a dry area where it's going to continue to dry just further stresses out our vegetation. So it makes it more susceptible to wildfires, but also to pest infestations. And we're seeing that in our watersheds, out in the mountains, but we're also seeing that in our urban watersheds. So in that sense, it has the hallmark of climate change.
Yeah, and or were you going to say something, Kelly?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think the other thing, a couple of other things in that, specific to that fire in that area. So as Laurna alluded to, the summertime rainfall at the high elevations up there, historically, the variability is actually not that great. Like, it falls within a pretty narrow range every summer of, you get 3, 4, 5, 6 inches of rain, some slightly wetter years, some slightly drier years. But last year in the summer was so much drier than kind of what had been on there, in addition to being hotter. So that is certainly part of it. And then also, the fire started in October. We shouldn't be having big fires starting. The fire season should be winding down by that point, not starting. As obviously it was the culmination of this huge fire season through the whole summer, but we shouldn't be seeing big fires starting in October and then becoming, one of the biggest fires in state history at that time of year.
Or June. They shouldn't be starting in June either.
Yeah. Oh, Laurna, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think in that note, right, it shouldn't be starting in June, it shouldn't be starting in October, right? That again gets back to the impacts of the warming that we've experienced over the last 30 years, right? So this warming is, aridifying our region, and that's just compromising so many different things. One thing, so I'm going to go on a quick tangent here just for a second. So one thing that we're really interested in trying to understand better is how is vegetation in our watersheds going to be changing over time? What's going to be surviving? How are species going to be evolving? How are they going to be adapting? Are they able to adapt fast enough for them to thrive? Are we going to start to see new species move in? And what does that look like? So when we experience a wildfire, one of the practices that we have in place at Denver Water is to help revegetate that region. But what do you revegetate with? How do you select plants and whatnot that are going to not survive, but thrive in the conditions that we have in the future? And then just as a more existential question, what do we want our community to look like? That is part of our community. What do we want our watersheds to look like? What species do we try to preserve? How do we help support species, ecosystems, really that are going to be able to thrive in a much warmer future? And I don't know what that looks like, but I think it's going to take all of us. It's going to take policy, funding, science, practitioners at all levels of the stakeholder, regime to engage and think through, what do we want our environment to look like and why, and how do we make that happen?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I see that we've only got 5 minutes left, and I know that Max has some closing remarks for us. But before I turn it over to him, I thought maybe we could try to end on a little bit of a hopeful note. And so I'd love to do a lightning round with our panelists. And if each of you could just share in like 30 seconds or less, what gives you hope about climate-informed policy and decision-making? And I will start with Kelly.
Oh, geez. Well, I gave one hopeful story, hopefully, and actually, just to maybe combine with the last thread, I would say that the more discussions we have like this, as the science progresses, I would say an opportunity. We've talked a lot about seasonality here, so in talking to practitioners and understanding the impacts and better understanding then how we can parse our climate projection information, we now know the sensitivity during transition seasons of like the June, it shouldn't happen now, the October shouldn't happen now. That like really helps scientists know what diagnostics, when to look for like the high impact kind of climate change. So I think the more we talk, that it gives scientists a lot of insight in terms of how to make more out of what we've always had, really, but just it was too much to grab at one time and to get our arms around. So I am really hopeful about all these little pieces of information that we get from our partners and stakeholders about the real impacts. So that's mine.
Thank you. And Sarah, how about you?
I would say that I am hopeful, looking at both at the state and federal level legislation that's happening to really help us get the work done, both at the state and lots of support for climate mitigation and adaptation at the local level. So that, I feel like we're now all aligned, starting to align and moving forward. And to me, that's really hopeful.
Fantastic. And Laurna?
Yeah, so those are really good points, right? So conversations are important. What's going on at the policy scale, the state and federal policy scale is critically important. And building on that, for me, the impacts as well as the most important adaptations are happening on the ground level, and we're seeing those actions take place. People are actively thinking about, what does climate change mean to me? What does warming mean to my system? And how do I make sure I'm prepared? We don't want to be caught off guard. We don't want to be unprepared. We don't want to be able to not meet our missions. And we also all live in this community. You know, we want to have a very strong, supportive, and, you know, thriving community. So that's what gives me hope, is the local action.
Great. And Russ?
People are creative, and we have, you know, whether it's in science or art or decision making or whatever the case might be. I think people are starting to come to terms, I guess, with the level of the you know, the issue that we're dealing with here. And you know, and sure that it's probably delayed from when some of that action could have or should have been taken. But people are creative, and when they put their minds and everything else to solving a problem, a lot of good things happen. So I'm hopeful on that front.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Max.
Thanks so much, Benét, and thanks, Russ, Kelly, Laurna, and Sarah. I won't put you on the spot right now, Benét, but I'd like to hear your answer to your own question there about what gives you hope too. I just want to say that, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, that really what we're trying to do here is exactly what you've just described, giving you hope, that we're trying to increase coordination and connectivity between scientists, policy actors, constituents in the state of Colorado. We have a lot of great things going on in this state, and we're trying to just help facilitate these very conversations, importantly as pathways to action and improvements. And so we can talk about it all we want, but if we don't make that connection, you know, we're selling ourselves short. So that's why just the range of all of you on the panel today is just really valuable. And I hope that everyone who's joined us for this particular session, that you've also found it really worthwhile. So thank you to all of you. I hope that those on this session are able to stay for our last session that starts at in 15 minutes, looking at carbon markets. And you can always find a recording if you want to rewatch what you've just seen in this session, or if you'd like to watch the rural broadband session from this morning, or the one that'll follow, as I mentioned, on carbon markets, you can find that on our website. Presley will put that in the chat. Presley Church, our communications director for the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. Or you could follow us on Twitter, and she'll put that in the chat as well. So we're excited to keep these conversations going. You know, as I wrap this up briefly and honor the break, I do also just want to thank again our partners, particularly with this set of panels today from the Institute of Science and Policy, Kristen Eulenbrock and her team there, and many of our team members on this side of the house, including David Unk, Matt Druckenmiller, who also co-leads this project with me, Presley, who I mentioned, Linda Pendergrass, David Zakovic, Katie Human, and previously working to get us to today were Kayla Zacharias and McCullough Blanton. So thank you all very much. Again, wonderful panel, great comments, and we hope to see you in 15 minutes in the next panel. Presley, do you have any final comments as we wrap things up?
That's all. Thanks for joining us here, and we will be posting that hopefully shortly after the conclusion of our last panel, so that you can share and view that recording. So thank you for joining us all today, and thank you, Kelly, Benét, Laurna, Sarah, and Russ.